hung low, casting an eerie silver glow over the quiet town of Adams, Tennessee. A chilling wind swept through the barren fields, rustling the brittle leaves clinging to the ground like reluctant witnesses. Emily Gray pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she stared at the weathered wooden sign, Bell Witch Cave, guided tours daily. She didn't believe in ghosts, but her curiosity had always been her downfall. Her best friend Clara had warned her against coming. "It's not just a story, Emily. People have gone missing. The Bell Witch doesn't let everyone leave." But Emily had laughed it off. Clara was always the superstitious type. As she descended the stone steps into the cavern, the air turned colder, thicker, as though something unseen coiled around her lungs. Her flashlight flickered against the jagged walls, illuminating shadows that danced unnaturally. At first, she dismissed it as her imagination, but then she heard it. Soft whispers, like 1,000 voices layered together, just at the edge of her hearing. She froze. "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice echoed, trembling as it bounced back at her. The whispers ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on her chest. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and moved deeper into the cave. That's when she saw it. A crude wooden doll propped against the wall, its face scratched into an expression of torment. A red string bound its arms, and a faint hum of energy seemed to pulse around it. The doll shouldn't have been terrifying. It was just a doll, after all, but something about it felt alive. The air around her grew colder still, and her breath came out in visible puffs. She reached out hesitantly, fingers trembling as they brushed the surface of the doll. The moment she touched it, a deafening scream pierced the air, a sound so inhuman it made her knees buckle. Emily scrambled backward, dropping the flashlight. Darkness enveloped her, and the whispers returned, louder this time, as if they were crawling into her ears. Then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. Her heart pounded as she fumbled for the flashlight, but when she switched it back on, she wasn't alone. A shadowy figure loomed at the far end of the cave, motionless, watching her. Its eyes, if they could be called that, glowed a deep, fiery red, and a guttural growl echoed through the cavern. "Emily?" The voice rasped, low and guttural, reverberating through her bones. "You should not have come here." Emily's legs felt as though they were made of lead, but instinct screamed at her to run. The figure remained motionless, its burning eyes locked onto hers. Her flashlight flickered again, the weak beam quivering as if afraid to expose whatever horror lurked in the shadows. I don't know what you want," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. The figure didn't respond. Instead, the shadows around it seemed to shift and stretch, slithering along the walls and ceiling, creeping closer to where Emily crouched. She stumbled backward, her hand brushing against the cursed doll she had dropped earlier. As her fingers made contact with the wooden figure, the whispers surged, drowning out every thought in her head. The voice returned, louder this time. "You trespass. You disturb." It wasn't just one voice, but a chorus of overlapping tones, male and female, young and old, all speaking in unison. "You will pay the price." The flashlight fell from her hands as her body was jerked upright by an unseen force. Her feet dangled above the ground, her screams echoing through the cavern as invisible fingers tightened around her throat. She clawed at the air, her vision blurring as the fiery eyes of the shadowy figure burned into her soul. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure vanished. Emily collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The doll lay inches from her face, but it was no longer just a doll. Its wooden face had twisted into a grotesque smile, the scratches now resembling words. "Leave." Scrambling to her feet, she snatched up the flashlight and turned toward the exit. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she ran. the beams of light bouncing wildly off the walls. But no matter how far she ran, the mouth of the cave never seemed to grow closer. She stopped, panting, her breath catching in her throat as she realized something horrifying. The walls of the cave had changed. The jagged rocks had been replaced by smooth black stone, glistening as if wet. The whispers were gone, replaced by a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from the very ground beneath her feet. And then she saw them. Dozens of figures lined the walls, their bodies frozen in twisted, agonized poses. Their faces were contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. Emily stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. "This can't be real," she whispered. But the truth clawed at the edges of her mind. These weren't statues. They were people. Before she could take another step, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The humming grew louder, vibrating through her bones, and the shadows closed in, swallowing the dim light of her flashlight. "Emily!" the voice hissed again, closer this time. "You belong to us now." Emily's scream died in her throat as the darkness tightened around her like a living, breathing entity. The air felt alive, charged with an unnatural energy that crawled along her skin. She clutched the flashlight like a lifeline, its flickering beams struggling against the encroaching void. From somewhere deep within the shadows came a slow, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was the unmistakable cadence of footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, growing louder with each step. Emily's heart pounded as she spun in frantic circles, the flashlight trembling in her hands. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice cracking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a whisper, low and venomous, slithered into her ear. "Do you feel it, Emily? The weight of all those who came before you." She whirled around, the beam of her flashlight landing on the walls again. The frozen figures seemed closer now, their eyes following her every move. One of them, a man with a hollow, gaping mouth, shifted ever so slightly. His arm twitched, and his head turned, the sound of cracking stone echoing through the cavern. "No, no, no," Emily muttered, backing away. Her foot caught on something and she fell hard onto the ground, her flashlight skittering out of reach. Darkness swallowed her, and she felt a cold, slimy texture beneath her palms. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around her like a storm. They weren't words anymore, but guttural, primal sounds that clawed at her sanity. She covered her ears, tears streaming down her face as the voices burrowed into her mind. "Don't listen," she told herself. "It's not real." But it felt real. The cold against her skin, the weight of the voices pressing against her skull, the damp, suffocating air. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, and then she saw it. A faint glow in the distance, pulsating like a heartbeat. It wasn't the cave's entrance. It was something deeper, something alive. Emily knew she should run the other way, but her body betrayed her. She crawled toward the light, her movements sluggish as if the cave itself was pulling her in. As she drew closer, the glow grew stronger, revealing a massive altar carved from black stone. Strange symbols pulsed along its surface, shifting and writhing like living things. At its center lay a figure cloaked in shadow, bound by chains that seemed to hum with an unholy energy. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The figure lifted its head, and for the first time she saw its face, or what was left of it. It was a grotesque mockery of humanity, its features twisted and melted, its eyes burning with the same fiery glow she had seen earlier. "Emily," it rasped, its voice cutting through the cacophony of whispers. "You came seeking the truth. Now you will become part of it." The chains shattered with a deafening crack, and the figure rose. The shadows around it surged forward like a tidal wave, engulfing everything in their path. Emily screamed as the darkness consumed her, pulling her into a void where time and reality ceased to exist. Emily's screams echoed into an abyss as she plummeted through the darkness. The world around her was shapeless, formless, an endless void punctuated only by the sound of her own ragged breathing and the faint, guttural whispers that now seemed to originate from inside her own mind. She landed with a sickening thud, her body sprawled on what felt like cold, wet stone. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, leaving her gasping as she tried to orient herself. But the darkness was impenetrable, wrapping around her like a shroud. "Where am I?" she croaked, her voice trembling as it dissipated into the void. The answer came, not in words but in images. Flashes of memories that didn't belong to her. Faces contorted in fear. Hands clawing at unseen forces. Screams that echoed through her skull. Each image burned itself into her mind, leaving behind a searing pain that made her clutch her head in agony. "You are where they all come to rest," the voice returned, soft but laced with malice. "The ones who sought what should never be found. The ones who heard the call and dared to answer." Emily scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. I didn't mean to disturb anything. I just wanted to." "To what?" the voice interrupted, sharp and mocking. "To prove the story's wrong? To satisfy your pathetic curiosity? Or perhaps—" The voice lowered, dripping with venom. "You were searching for something you've lost." Her breath hitched. It wasn't possible. How could it know? How could it know about her brother? "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Tears blurred her vision, though there was nothing to see in the suffocating dark. "You're lying. You don't know anything about him." A cruel laugh echoed around her, reverberating through the emptiness. "Oh, but I do. He called out to me once, just as you are doing now. Do you want to see him, Emily? Do you want to know where he's been all this time?" Her heart clenched. James had disappeared years ago, vanished without a trace during a family camping trip near these very woods. She had always blamed herself for looking away, for not noticing when he wandered off. The thought that he might still be here, trapped in this nightmare, made her stomach twist with dread. "No," she choked out, her voice trembling. "You're lying. He's gone. He can't be here." But the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like vultures circling prey. A faint light appeared in the distance, faint and flickering, and as she stared at it, the voice whispered, "See for yourself." Despite every instinct screaming at her to run, Emily's feet moved on their own. The light grew brighter with each step, illuminating a small, circular chamber. At its center stood a figure, hunched and trembling, its back to her. "James?" she whispered, her voice cracking. The figure turned slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it came into view, Emily's stomach dropped. It was James, or what was left of him. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that radiated an unnatural, sickly glow. "Emily," he rasped, his voice a haunting echo of the brother she once knew. "You shouldn't have come here." Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground as James took a shuddering step toward her. "They won't let you leave," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Not like this." The shadows around them began to shift and pulse, closing in like a living tide. Emily tried to move, tried to reach for her brother, but her body refused to obey. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was James's outstretched hand and the faint, broken whisper, "I'm sorry." Emily's world went black again, but this time, there was no falling sensation. Instead, she felt weightless, suspended in an endless void. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound, deafening silence. It was as if the very air had been stripped away, leaving her in a vacuum of nothingness. And then, faintly, a voice emerged, not the malicious, mocking voice from before, but a soft, trembling one. "Emily, it's me." Her heart leapt. "James?" she croaked, her voice breaking. The void around her flickered, and a faint light appeared, illuminating James's face. But something was different. His features were no longer twisted and hollow. He looked human, tired, but human. "I don't have much time," he said, his voice urgent. "Listen to me. You need to get out of here before it's too late." Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave you. Not again. Emily, stop!" James's voice cracked like a whip, silencing her. "You don't understand. This place, it doesn't let go. Not completely. But you're still alive. You have a chance to escape. If you stay here, they'll take you too." She reached out to him, her fingers trembling. "But how? How do I get out?" James hesitated, his gaze darting to the shadows that writhed and pulsed at the edges of the light. "You have to let go of me," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Her chest tightened. "What? No, I can't." "You have to," he interrupted, his voice desperate. "This place feeds on you, on your guilt, your fear, your love. It's using me to keep you here. Emily, if you don't let go, it'll take you too." The shadows surged closer, their movements frantic and chaotic, like predators sensing their prey slipping away. Emily could feel them brushing against her skin, cold and slimy, pulling at her, whispering promises of reunion, of peace. "Emily," James said, his voice cracking, "I'm already gone. I've been gone for years. You have to let me go, please." She sobbed, shaking her head as the light around him began to flicker and fade. "I don't know how," she whispered. "Yes, you do," he said softly, a faint smile on his lips. "You've always been stronger than you think." The light dimmed further, and the shadows grew bolder, clawing at her legs, her arms, her mind. James's form began to dissolve, his features blurring as he mouthed one final word. "Run." Emily screamed as the void shattered around her. She was back in the cave, the cursed altar looming before her, the doll at its base grinning with malevolent glee. The air was thick with whispers, but they no longer felt like voices. They felt like chains, pulling her back toward the altar. With a surge of adrenaline, she grabbed the doll and hurled it into the darkness. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the ground beneath her began to tremble. The shadows surged toward her, but she didn't stop. She ran, her feet pounding against the uneven ground, her flashlight flickering wildly. The cave seemed endless, the walls shifting and twisting around her, but she didn't look back. And then, suddenly, she saw it, the faint glow of the entrance, a sliver of moonlight cutting through the suffocating darkness. She pushed herself harder, her lungs burning, her legs screaming in protest. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of anger and desperation, but she didn't stop. With one final leap, she burst through the entrance and into the cold open air. She collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath as the cave behind her fell silent. The whispers were gone. The shadows had retreated, but as she lay there, staring up at the night sky, she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible pull, like a thread wrapped around her soul. The Bell Witch wasn't done with her. Not yet. The chill of the night air stung Emily's skin, grounding her in the moment. She lay sprawled on the damp grass outside the cave, her chest heaving with each labored breath. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over. The stars above glimmered faintly, indifferent to the horrors she had faced within the cave's depths. But deep down, she knew. The faint pull, like a thread wound tightly around her very soul, reminded her that she hadn't truly escaped. Not yet. She sat up, shivering, her eyes locked on the cave entrance. The darkness beyond seemed alive, shifting and writhing, as though the shadows themselves were watching her. She wanted to turn away, to run as far as she could, but she couldn't. The feeling of unfinished business clung to her like a second skin. "James," she whispered, her voice breaking. Her brother's face, so real in the void, was burned into her memory. The way he had looked at her, pleaded with her. It wasn't something she could ignore. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint whisper that sent a chill down her spine. It was her name, spoken so softly she almost didn't hear it. Emily. She scrambled to her feet, her pulse quickening. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The wind stilled, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, from the cave, a figure emerged. It moved slowly, deliberately, its outline illuminated by the pale moonlight. Her breath caught in her throat. "James." The figure stepped closer, and for a moment she dared to hope. But as it came into view, the truth became horrifyingly clear. It wasn't James. It wasn't human. The figure was a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and flesh, its form constantly shifting as though it couldn't quite hold itself together. Its eyes glowed with that same fiery red light, and its mouth twisted into a jagged smile. "Did you really think you could leave?" it rasped, its voice a chilling blend of her brother's and something far darker. "You belong to us now." Emily stumbled backward, her mind racing. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're lying. I escaped. I'm free." The creature laughed, a sound that reverberated through her bones. "Free?" it mocked. "You carry us with you, Emily. Wherever you go, we will follow. We are in your mind, your soul. You opened the door, and now it can never be closed." Her knees buckled, but she refused to fall. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. The creature's smile widened, its form growing larger, more imposing. "Then run," it hissed. "Run, and see how far you get." Emily turned and bolted, her feet pounding against the ground as she raced away from the cave. The forest around her was a blur, branches clawing at her skin, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the whispers. They were in her ears, her head, her very bones. And when she glanced over her shoulder, the creature was there, always there, its fiery eyes burning through the darkness. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, she was gasping for breath, her legs threatening to give out. She stumbled onto the gravel road, collapsing under the glow of a flickering streetlight. A car approached, its headlights cutting through the night. Emily waved her arms frantically, and the vehicle screeched to a halt. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stepped out. "Are you okay, miss?" he asked, concern etched into his features. Emily tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She pointed toward the forest, her hands shaking. It's coming," she managed to choke out. The man glanced toward the trees, his brow furrowing. "There's nothing there," he said. She turned, and to her horror, he was right. The forest was still, the cave a distant memory. But the whispers, they were still there, faint and insidious, wrapping around her like a noose. The man helped her into the car, his voice calm and reassuring. But as they drove away, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows in the back seat were watching her, waiting. And when she glanced into the rearview mirror, she saw them, those fiery red eyes, glowing in the darkness. The Bell Witch had followed her home,